Hello, this is our guide for the Trial of the Crusader raid on 10-man difficulty. For the sake of the video, we decided to do this raid as 9 players. Here we have 5 encounters with absolutely no trash mobs to clear along the way. The first encounter in the Trial of the Crusader includes 3 beasts of Northrend, the first of which is Gormok the Impaler. Gormok impales his current tank and applies a stack and bleed effect for which the tanks need to swap once they have a couple of stacks, so neither takes too much damage. The boss also stomps the ground to interrupt spellcasts, so the ranged DPS and healers must stay at least 15 yards away from the boss to avoid it. Our DPS and healers also need to avoid standing in the flame that spawn next to them during the fight. Finally, there are snowballs that join the fight and stick themselves to players. Once the boss dies, they no longer attach themselves to players and can be tagged and killed quickly. The second part of Northrend beasts include 2 worms, namely Acidmaw and Dreadscale. Each tank picks one and faces them away from the raid as they can spew damaging abilities at players standing in front of them. Both worms can spawn growing acid puddles on the ground, so they need to be moved away from these puddles before any player accidentally steps on them. The major abilities of these worms are known as Burning Bile and Paralysis. Acidmaw can apply paralysis on random people in raid, including the tank, which gradually slows them down until they can no longer move. On the other hand, the tank handling Dreadscale receives Burning Bile, which can remove paralysis debuff if the tank moves over afflicted players. Notice that when one worm dies, the other worm enrages, so you can either try to kill them at the same time or kill Dreadscale first as it deals more damage, and then deal with Acidmaw, but in this case you won't be able to remove paralysis. Our tank here got paralysis at the end, but he removed it using Divine Shield. The last beast is Icehowl. Icehowl can be handled by a single tank. During the fight, he turns towards random players and uses Arctic Breath, dealing frost damage and freezing all players in path for a few seconds. To mitigate this ability, players can spread out so fewer players are frozen each time. The main ability is Massive Crash. The boss jumps to the center of the arena, knocks everyone into the walls and selects a random player to charge into. After a short stun, players get some movement speed to run out of the boss's way. If everyone stays out of the way when he charges, the boss hits the wall, gets a stun and receives 100% extra damage for a couple of seconds. If the boss hits a player, the player dies and the boss enrages, dealing massive damage to whomever tanks it, so it's a must to dodge the charge ability. In this video, 2 of the raid members got hit, instantly died, and the tank uses his strongest defensive ability to handle the enraged boss. The second encounter in this raid is that of Lord Jaraxxus. Jaraxxus casts Felfire Ball on his tank, which can be easily interrupted else it deals damage and leaves a dot. One of the more dangerous abilities is Incinerate Flesh. One player gets this debuff at a time and absorbs a large amount of healing for a while. Healers must immediately aim to heal through this absorb shield to fully break it, else the player explodes and deals raid-wide fire damage. The boss spawns 2 types of adds using Nether Portal and Volcano. These adds are called Mistress of Pain and Infernals. They can be gathered by the same tank or a separate one and moved to the melee zone so the others can cleave them down. Throughout the fight, the boss gains a couple of stacks of a buff called Nether Power. This buff can be removed using abilities such as Dispel Magic or Purge, or can be stolen using Spell Steal of Mages. If the buff stays on the boss, it greatly increases the damage done by certain boss abilities. He also instantly casts Fell Lightning ability that deals damage to multiple players. Random players get Legion Flame and leave behind flames wherever they go. Simply run out of the group if you have it and put the flames next to the walls. In the third encounter, we fight against the faction champions. There are 6 bosses on 10-man difficulty, and there's a random combination of classes. 2 of these bosses are healers and the rest are damage dealers. Just like actual players, you cannot crowd control them for too long, because they have reduced duration on players. They also receive less AoE damage, so it's always recommended that you focus on one boss at a time. For a set encounter, you can set a kill order and focus on the most dangerous ones and move on to the least deadly bosses. Among the damage dealers, rogues are known to be the deadliest, as they can shadow step behind raid members and deal high damage, so they get the highest priority in kill order. Warrior, DK, and Retribution Paladin are the next in line. Then you can deal with the other classes such as Shadow Priest, Balance Droid, Mage, or Warlock, and finally the healers. You don't have any third table, meaning that you cannot hold them on the tanks forever. The tanks can and should taunt them to keep them away from the other raid members for as long as possible. The enemy healers can be neutralized using stuns, cyclones, or rogue poisons to reduce healing or increase the cast time, but it's more important to remove the HUDs on the current boss using Mass Spell and Purge. In the fourth encounter of TFC, we fight the twin Val'kyrs. Before pulling the bosses, you will see 2 light and 2 dark portals at each corner of the room. Clicking on the light portal gives you a buff that increases damage onto the dark boss and reduces damage taken from the light boss, and that's vice versa if you take the dark portal. To be able to maintain aggro, each tank should take the buff with the opposite color of the boss they want to tank. Throughout the encounter, small orbs pour out of the corners of the room and move in random directions. Soaking the orbs with the same color as your current buff causes you no damage and grants you 1 stack of a buff which does nothing on its own until it reaches 100 stacks. At this point you get Surge of Light or Darkness and deal 100% more DPS. Soaking orbs of the opposite color, on the other hand, will cause damage to you. Val'kyrs have 2 major abilities. One boss at a time can shield itself and start a long cast that eventually heals them both, if not interrupted. To interrupt the cast, first you need to DPS and break the shield, and in order to maximize the damage, you can click on the portal with the opposite color of the boss casting the shield. Here in this video, although we broke the shield, nobody used any interrupt ability, so the Val'kyrs got healed. The other ability is Vortex, which deals massive raid-wide damage, but it can be greatly reduced if players take the same buff as the color of the boss casting Vortex. The last encounter in the trial of the Crusader is Anub'arak. This boss has 2 phases with a submerged phase in between. Players can see the frost spheres flying overhead. These orbs have low HP and can be killed to create more permafrost zones. During the fight, the boss summons Nerubians from sides of the room. These asks should be gathered by a separate tank and moved over icy zones called permafrost ground. Nerubians will try to submerge from time to time to heal themselves, but that won't be possible if they're on the icy zone. Last phase starts when the boss reaches 30% health, but before that happens, the boss can submerge. When that happens, the boss is no longer attackable, and instead he will start chasing random players with his sharp spikes. Targeted players can move over permafrost ground to prevent the boss from chasing them. At this point, the boss picks a new target and goes after them. During the submerge phase, scraps spawn all around the room which need to be killed before they apply too many dots on people. Notice that boss's movement speed increases gradually until he hits permafrost ground zone, so no player can kite the boss for too long. When the last phase starts, the boss uses Leeching Swarm ability to steal health from other players until the end of the encounter. Leeching Swarm steals health based on the remaining amount of HP that the player has. So the lower the health on player, the less the healing received by the boss. To make it short, healers should try not to overheal the entire raid and instead focus on healing the tanks and players who receive penetrating cold debuff. The rest of the players can be kept at around 30 to 40% health to prevent the boss from healing too much. And that concludes our guide for TSC 10 Normal. Thank you so much for watching this video. If this was helpful, feel free to like and subscribe and let us know what other guides you want to see.